This video deals with hearing and the ear, which includes senses of equilibrium and balance. So we will be covering all of that. It's slightly longer than taste and smell and probably a little shorter than the vision video, but put them all together and that was what will be on your chapter test. So, the organ of the ear, including the inner ear and the middle ear, houses two senses. It houses hearing, which most people know about, but it also houses equilibrium, which helps you with your balance, or is actually essential to balance. All of the receptors that we're talking about in this subunit are mechanoreceptors because they involve physical manipulation of receptors. All right, so there are three different parts of the ear. The outer ear is what you interact with on a daily basis, or maybe a daily basis. It includes the pinna, which is the outside part of your ear, and the ear canal. The middle ear is from the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane, to the cochlea, which is this little inside sort of shell-shaped organ. And the vestibule, the cochlea, and the semicircular canals are all part of the inner ear. The inner ear is where the receptors actually are, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. All right, so the external ear has only hearing organs in it. The structures are the pinna. The pinna is also sometimes called the auricle. And the external auditory canal. The external auditory canal is something that has hairs in it. It has modified sweat glands that make wax called carumen, which is actually modified sweat, and is the part that you are probably most familiar with. The auditory canal is there's a skin, it has epithelium on it. The chamber is through the temporal bone. Remember that from the skeleton chapter, the external auditory meatus. There are the glands that make earwax are called the caruminous glands because they make carumen. Fun fact, which I believe we talked about before, is that people of Asian descent and tend to make dry earwax, where people of European descent tend to make sticky earwax. And people of both persuasions think that the other kind of earwax is so super weird. So the dry earwax is very crumbly, and they have a whole different, Asian people have a totally different system of removing it, which involves sticking a little wand into your ear and sort of grabbing it out, as opposed to people with sticky earwax that use Q-tips to squish it out. Both of which are totally not recommended. You're never supposed to stick anything in your external auditory canal, and everybody does it. So, fun fact, everybody does it and nobody should. And then the external auditory canal butts up against the tympanic membrane, which is your eardrum, which it signifies the start of the middle ear. The middle ear should be filled with air, though if you've had an ear infection recently, you probably have it full. It's probably full of, it could have a liquid in it, or it could have, pus in it if you've had an ear infection, both of which are not ideal because it causes pressure and pain. And again, the middle ear has only hearing organs. It doesn't have any balance or equilibrium organs in it. So the middle ear starts at the tympanic membrane. It has the malleus, which is the hammer, which is one of the smallest bones in your body. There are three small bones: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Either one, the Latin terms or the not English terms for those are acceptable. But collectively, they are called the ossicles. And they are those tiny bones in your ear. And what happens is that sound waves come in, they shake the tympanic membrane shakes the malleus shakes the anvil hits shakes the stapes, and then the stapes bangs up against the cochlea here, and that's how mechanical movements of sound waves shake the tympanic membrane, and that is turned into vibrations in the inner ear that your body can sense. All right, so in your middle ear, you have the auditory canal that's covered with the tympanic membrane, but then you also have a second tube called the eustachian tube, and we'll go back to the picture and look at it in a second. The eustachian tube is the connection between the middle ear, and this here empties out into the nasal cavity, and in adults, it's angled like this, and it's fairly long. However, if you have a good head cold and you blow your nose a lot, blowing your nose increases your intracranial pressure, and you can get mucus and bacteria up into this middle ear. Normally, the eustachian tube is collapsed. You know how to open it. It's how you pop your ears. If you've been swimming, swimming puts a lot of pressure on your ears. Also, if you're in flight, if you're in an airplane, you pop your ears. Pressure builds up in the middle ear because it has a fixed amount of air in it. And when you pop your eustachian tubes, you open up the eustachian tube and it allows that pressure to equalize. If you have a bad head cold, you can't do that. You'll say that you feel like your ears are stuffed up. Most people perceive that as your auditory canal being full, but it isn't. What it means is that you have excess pressure here and maybe fluid in your ears. It should drain out. When you were a child, you probably had a lot more ear infections than you have now, if you had them at all. And the reason for that is because of the way that a child's head is shaped and facial bones have not yet developed. Their eustachian tube is very horizontal, and because of that, it causes bacteria, and it's very short, and so it allows bacteria to crawl up into the middle ear, and it doesn't let it drain very well, so it causes a lot of middle ear infections in small children. A middle ear infection, the tympanic membrane is very sensitive. They can be incredibly painful for little people, actually for big people too, but little people are prone to getting them. It can cause hearing loss. It can cause just a lot of pain and suffering in children. So one of the things that they will do is what we call putting tubes in the ears. And what you do is you make a little incision and you put a little cannula, so a little sort of rubber donut shaped structure inside the tympanic membrane. It does not prevent you from getting an ear infection, but an ear infection itself is not particularly painful. It's the pressure that is painful. So children who have tubes in their ears, it allows the mucus to drain out of that cannula. And children one of my daughters had tubes in her ears, and when she got an ear infection after that, the pus and mucus from the insides of her ears would just run out of her ears. They like dribble out of her ears. And I had a student once who told me that he had tubes in his ears, and he had to cover his ears all the time because his ears were always leaking mucus because he had such terrible ear infections. So it doesn't stop the ear infections, it just makes them less painful, so kids can do things like go to school and live a life. Kids that age have runny noses all the time anyway, so a runny ear isn't much of a difference. So equalizing pressure, but the side effect of that is allowing for a lot of middle ear infections. And the middle ear is really great for infections because it's warm, wet, and dark, which is the big three of why ear infections happen, or like any infections. All bacteria love warm, wet, and dark conditions. All right, so we're done with that. The malleus and the incus and the stapes, we talked about that, so we're all set with those. Those are the ossicles. So we talked about this. Vibrations come in the auditory canal. They cause the tympanic membrane, which is just a very thin layer of skin, to vibrate. That causes the malleus to shake. The malleus causes the incus to shake, and the incus causes the stapes to shake, and that is going to bang against the cochlea, which transfers those vibrations into pressure or vibrations in the inner ear where you're going to sense them. All right, on to the inner ear. The inner ear, or sometimes called the bony labyrinth, which is just a fun name for it, involves the cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canals. And it allows, you have nerves coming in, and cranial nerves, actually specifically the vestibulocochlear nerve, comes in and innervates and causes those vibrations that you've been hearing, that have been coming from the external ear and coming through the middle ear, allows them to be transferred into nerve impulses that you can interpret later on as sound. The whole structure is filled with liquid, mostly called perilymph. There is some endolymph in there, and we'll talk about that later. And then the semicircular canals here in the vestibule have to do with balance. So now you have both organs of hearing and organs of balance. All right, so the three parts are the cochlea. The cochlea is the shell-shaped part. The vestibule is this part here, and then the semicircular canals are the little loops that come off of it. All right, the organ of Corti is the organ that causes hearing to happen. It's located inside the cochlea. It has receptors that are called hair cells. And I think it's better if we look at the picture of it and then we can come back to this, and it will make more sense. So let's see if we can find the picture that goes with it. All right, so let's actually start here. If you take a little section of the shell-shaped cochlea and you look inside one of those circles, it looks like this. So that's the outside of one of those circles. And so the tube has a vestibular membrane running around each side of it. The holes in that are filled with perilymph. And then sort of sandwiched like a pizza slice on the inside is the organ of Corti. And the organ of Corti is going to have, if you blow up this part here that's sort of in the very middle of the circle, it has a bunch of different membranes. So it has this weird basilar membrane here, and then on top of it, it has this sort of all of this is very like squishy and jelly because the whole idea is that it vibrates. So the vibrations vibrate through the perilymph. That causes the vestibular membranes to shake. The vestibular membranes shake this tectoral membrane, and the tectoral membrane is touching these hair cells. The hair cells vibrate and send a message down the cochlear nerve if they vibrate at the right frequency. So this is where you get the right, you have heard about having the right kind of impulse, the right kind of stimulus. So these all are going to vibrate they all vibrate because of the perilymph, but if they are vibrated at a particular frequency, that causes them to depolarize and send the message down the cochlear nerve. So it has to be the right frequency for the hair cells. As you get older, you lose the high frequency hearing, and that can be sped up if you spend a lot of time listening to very loud music. Going to concerts is a great way to lose your hearing. If you know this, if you've ever had ringing in your ears after you've had heard loud noise. Also, some job sites, I frequently say that we should be provided earplugs when we go to the Winter Carnival Pep Rally. The Winter Carnival Pep Rally is something that is very, very loud, loud enough to cause hearing damage at sustained levels. And so if you leave that event and your ears are ringing, that's actually that hair cell dying. And once it dies, you don't get it back, and you can never have that part of the hearing again. So let's go back to our notes. So the tectoral membrane bends the hair cells. If it is at the right frequency, it sends that impulse to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, and that's where you will get that sensation of hearing. So that's where you will perceive that as a noise that you know at that frequency. So I've said this a bunch of times, but here it is in notes form. Vibrations move the tectoral membranes, hair cells are bent by the membrane, and action potential starts on the cochlear nerve. And if you have continuous stimulation, that can lead to adaptation. So if you hear something over and over and over again, at some point you might stop hearing it. All right. So this is telling you about sort of what the purpose of all these things are. So the pinna, or the auricle, captures the sound. The amplitude is the same. It hits the tympanic membrane. The hammer, the anvil, and the stapes, so your ossicles, are there to amplify the sound. So they increase it, so it allows you to hear smaller noises more clearly. And then the sound waves pass through the oval window, which is in the vestibule, and then it is sensed by the organ of Corti and is stimulated, and then eventually those sound waves will die out as they sort of lessen as they travel into the ear and into the brain. All right, the organs of equilibrium are the vestibule and the semicircular canals, so we're going to leave the cochlea behind for now. So equilibrium has two functional parts. It has static equilibrium, which is where your head is in space. So if you come conscious after a series of unconscious time, you think, like, where has your head been in space? So has it been, is your head upright? Is it tilted to the side? And it's not just your neck muscles that are going to sense that for you. It is actually your, part of it is for your vestibule is going to do that for you. And I'll show you how in a second. Dynamic equilibrium, however, is like how is your head moving in space? So the motion. So if you move your head around in a circle, what's happening there, and how do you sense that, and how eventually will that make you dizzy and maybe even sick from motion sickness. All right, so there are how these things work. Static equilibrium, it has to do with the macula. The macula are receptors in the vestibule, and they are bent by gravity, and there are, and I'm going to show you a little picture. Actually, I'm going to show you pictures because it makes more sense if you do that. So here's the vestibule. This is the cochlea. There are the semicircular canals. So we're just talking about the vestibule. And lining the whole thing is, again, a gel-like membrane called the otolithic membrane. And at the top, there are these tiny little stones called otoliths. And this is actually a really good picture of that. So the otoliths are at the top. If you turn your head, the force of gravity, the otoliths are heavier than the membrane, so it causes it to push down. That causes the hair cells to bend and depolarizes these membranes. They send a message through the vestibulocochlear nerve and the vestibular part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it is going to send a message to your brain that your head is in that position. And this in class is where I would ask you what part of the brain, and hopefully you would say the cerebellum, because that's the part of your brain where balance and equilibrium and coordination come from. All right, so dynamic equilibrium happens within the semicircular canals. Within the semicircular canals, there are these little structures called crista ambulari, really. And they are a little sort of cap of gel called the cupula. The semicircular canals are full of a liquid called endolymph that will move around in your head as you spin. And then within that cupula are the hair cells, the hairs of the hair cells. And the hair cells are the neurons that, if the cupola is bent over, those hair cells are bent over, and depolarization happens, that sends a message down the vestibular part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. I would remind you that on a test, I would want you to know that it's the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that is cranial nerve 8, VIII. And that causes depolarization, and that would go to probably your cerebellum, but probably also your cerebrum, to let you know, the sensory cortex, to let you know that your head is spinning around in space. I usually at this point would show you some sort of video about both ballerinas and dancers who use spotting. There are two different professions that involve, or sports, if you will, that cause a lot of spinning. Dancers do this thing called spotting, where they keep their head in one place and then they whip it right around when they can't turn their body anymore, or their body's turned so far that their head has to move. Then they whip it around and they focus their eyes on one particular space, like spot in the distance, which is why it's called spotting. But then if you look at a bunch of if you look at figure skaters do a great deal of spinning, and they spin and spin and spin and spin with no adaptation to that. And from the figure skaters that I've taught, the word on the street is that they just do it and get used to it. I think that they're both strategies, but it involves a lot of getting used to it, because you need to do 1,000 turns and then, spins, and then come out of it and do something else in both of those professions or sports. So you can adapt to this, but for some people it makes you very sick. Think of the Turkish twist at Canopy Lake Park. All right, so in angular movements, this is what we just talked about. The cupola stimulates the hair cells, and the impulse is sent down the vestibular nerve to the cerebellum. I will remind you, the vestibular nerve meets up with the cochlear nerve, which does the sound stuff of this, and they form the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 8, VIII. All right, this ends it for us for this lecture. Again, take notes on it and hand them in for credit.